How did Death Valley get its name? It's time to tell a story.
The tale behind how Death Valley got its name is one of dreams, tragedy, and perseverance. The year was 1849. News of gold discovered in California spread like wildfire, and this year thousands of people made their way there in hope of a new and better life. One of these groups of hopefuls came from Salt Lake City, Utah. They were eager to get on the road, but they feared that the weather might have other plans for them. The journey to California from Salt Lake City required them to pass over the Sierra Nevada mountains, but everyone knew all too well not to do this late in the year. Too late of a departure, and you risked getting caught in the deadly snowstorms that bombarded the mountains. This wasn't just a cautionary belief either, it was a surefire warning. These Salt Lake City hopefuls could freshly recall the tragic tale of a group just a few years prior who had attempted to pass over the mountains during the winter. Their name was the Donner Party, and only 48 members of their nearly 90-person group survived. The Donner Party set off looking for a better life, much like the Salt Lake hopefuls. They heard of a shortcut they could take to California, and one that shaved off nearly 300 miles from their trip. It sounded too good to be true, and as they would find out, it was. They encountered numerous obstacles on their journey, and the so-called shortcut delayed their arrival into the Sierra Nevada mountains. By the time they got to the mountains, winter was in full swing, and they found themselves trapped in a snowstorm. The details of how they survived this are gruesome and tragic. And perhaps the most important piece of advice comes from a 13-year-old survivor. She wrote to her cousin in a letter after making it out of the mountains alive, and offered up the warning to never take any shortcuts. This story was fresh in everyone's minds in 1849 as they waited to depart Salt Lake City, and understandably, no one planned to risk getting caught by the weather. Unfortunately, it was looking like the Salt Lake hopefuls were going to have to wait until the winter ended to make their trek into California. That is, until they heard about the Old Spanish Trail. The Old Spanish Trail was rumored to go around the mountains instead of through them, so it was safe to travel in the winter. Except there was only one problem with this. No pioneer wagon like them had ever made the trek, and they could only find one guy in town that knew the trail and was willing to take them. So I guess technically that's two problems. This man's name was Captain Jefferson Hunt, and the Salt Lake hopefuls that embarked alongside him were known as the San Joaquin Company. The pace of their journey was slow and steady, and some feared that it was too slow. Captain Hunt would only go as fast as the slowest wagon so that he didn't leave anyone behind, but other travelers became very impatient with this. The restlessness among the travelers continued to grow until one day a man rode into camp on his horse and promised a solution to their problem. A shortcut called Walker Pass that would shave nearly 500 miles off their long journey. He showed these people a hand-drawn map of the so-called shortcut. They figured that as long as they continued west, surely they would find Walker Pass. So the majority of these 107 wagons left behind Captain Hunt in the Old Spanish Trail in pursuit of Walker Pass and their rumored shortcut. But as soon as they began their journey, they encountered a gaping canyon blocking their way. Because of this, many of the Salt Lake hopefuls decided to turn back and rejoin Captain Hunt. But still, more than 20 wagons pressed on, convinced that they could go around the canyon and find the pass after all. This decision to continue is exactly what would go on to give Death Valley its name. The group traversed varying valleys, summits, and finally they reached a location called Groom Lake. This lake is right around where the well-known Area 51 military base is located today. Unfortunately for these thirsty travelers, though, this wasn't as much of a lake as much as it was a salt flat, or a dried-up lake where nothing but salt remains. One group, known as the Bennett Arcan Party, was set on finding a water source. To the distant south sat a snowy mountain that the Bennett Arcan Party thought might provide the water that they so desperately needed. But the rest of the group wasn't in agreement. The other party, known as the Jayhawkers, wanted to stick with the original plan of heading west, For them, a diversion to the south was not the way to go. So the groups went their separate ways, and both experienced challenges along their routes. Their thirst for water continued to worsen until both groups were on the brink of dying of thirst. But then, just as all hope seemed lost, a snowstorm rolled in and provided the water that they so desperately needed. After this, the groups pressed on, and at this point, it had been 2 months since they left behind Captain Hunt's caravan. This means that it had been 2 months traveling with no guidance and very limited food and water. Eventually, both groups ended up in Death Valley, and both groups were now faced with crossing the mountainous desert. Wait, did I just say the mountainous desert? Much like the shock they had in discovering that the canyon wasn't on their map, our travelers were also surprised to see mountains spread across Death Valley. Some thought these were the Sierra Nevadas, and that they were closing in on the end of their journey. But sadly, this wasn't the case at all. These were the Panamint Mountains, a smaller range to the east of the Sierra Nevadas. Regardless, though, they stood like a great wall blocking their path to safety, riches, and a better life. And right here is where we really see the stories of the two groups diverge. So let's begin with the Jayhawkers. The Jayhawkers pressed further west, committed to sticking to the original plan. As they neared the base of the Panamint Mountains, they encountered a massive stretch of sand dunes, spread over miles and miles. These were the Mesquite Flat sand dunes, and there was no way their wagons would be able to travel across this terrain. So they decided to walk the remainder of the way. The Jayhawkers destroyed their wagons and slaughtered the oxen that they had brought with them. They used the wood from the wagons to make fires and cook the meat of the oxen. After this meal, it was time to set off once again, but this time with no wagons, no animals, and only the supplies that they could carry on their backs. As it would turn out, though, this decision to cross the desert was a good one. They found a pass to cross through the mountains, and after turning a little south, they found a prominent Indian trail. They followed this trail further south, and finally, after months in the wilderness, they found their way back to civilization. The Jayhawkers' journey was complete, but our story of the Bennett Arcan Party is just getting started. While the Jayhawkers managed to successfully cross the Panamint Mountains, the Bennett Arcan Party struggled to do so. After a failed attempt to cross, they retreated to the valley floor to rest and reconsider their options. They believed that the Panamint Mountains were actually the Sierra Nevadas, and this was a dangerous misconception. So, because they thought they were right next to the Sierra Nevadas, they thought that civilization wasn't far away. So, they sent 2 young men to journey over the mountain, find civilization, and get some supplies. These men were named William Lewis Manley and John Rogers, and they set off on what would be a long and arduous journey. The men walked over 300 miles in search of help. Finally, though, they reached San Fernando, got supplies, and turned around to make the trek back. They had acquired 2 horses and a one-eyed mule, but all 3 animals didn't make the journey back. Meanwhile, back at camp, the hope of the Bennett Arcan Party began to dwindle. William and John had been gone for nearly a month, and a lot of people thought that they weren't coming back. As the days went on, more and more began to give up on the hope that these men would come back and save them. So they set off once more to find their own ways out of the valley. Eventually, though, William and John did return to camp with supplies, and fortunately, they didn't wind up alone. 2 families with children had stayed behind, committed to trusting that the 2 men would return and help them. 1 man had perished during their long wait, but the rest remained alive. The party navigated over the mountains at last, and while they were doing this, they turned to gaze at the desert that they had so narrowly escaped. One member is said to have proclaimed at this moment, "Goodbye, Death Valley." And so, the name was born. After another 23 days of travel through the Mojave Desert, the remaining members of the Bennett Arcan Party finally reached the safety of civilization. Their journey was long, costly, and eventually the very event that brought the name of Death Valley into existence. Thanks so much for joining me for today's story time, and I will see you in the next one.